All right. Greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel's back again with a very special episode with Alan Maynard Wald, who is an American professor emeritus of English literature and American culture at the University of Michigan, the author of numerous books that focus on 20th century American literature, communist writers, and the literary left. Alan Wald is the new his new book, recently published with historical materialism, is entitled Bohemian Bolsheviks: Dispatches from the Culture and History of the Left. This is a 500-page tour de force examination of a number of essays dealing with the literary left. Now, this is a very special episode, I think, because this constitutes in some way your life's work. And, it's a real honor to have you on the show, Alan. I am familiar with many of the authors that you write about, some obviously more than others. I want to begin by asking you if you could give us a sort of a bigger full scope picture, how this book, Bohemian Bolsheviks, relates to your earlier books. And I love so many of your earlier books looking at various figures in the Trotskyist movement, the anti-Stalinist left, and this sort of evolution of the American left as read through these very charismatic and dynamic literary figures that capture your attention. You are an expert, by the way, on Richard Wright, on Mike Gold, Lorraine Hansberry, James T. Farrell, who was the topic of your first book. Is that right?
Yes, my doctoral dissertation was my first book.
So how does this latest work of yours, Bohemian Bolsheviks, and also why did you choose that title? How does it relate to your earlier books?
Okay, it's sort of a complicated question, but there's an arc to my life and career, and I think I can do some placing here. First of all, I became interested in the problem of political commitment in high school, or maybe even to some extent junior high school, when I was pretty alienated from the society, and friends gave me radical books. I probably didn't know they were radical. I mean, one of the first was Dalton Trumbo's Johnny Got His Gun. I probably didn't know that Trumbo was a communist, but I was, taken aback. It's a devastating attack on World War I and disillusionment with World War I, which is the background to a lot of 20th century leftism, is that original disillusionment. And later on, a high school teacher, seeing that I was bored with, Sir Walter Scott and Silas Marner and the kind of books they were forcing on us in our classes, told me to read Richard Wright. And I read Black Boy and was completely astonished, and went on to Native Son and The Outsider and everything else that was in print back then. This would be the early 1960s. So, I had that interest in literature of the left. Again, I probably didn't understand much about communism or Marxism then, but this literature of the left was drawing me. And at the same time, the existentialist writers, they also had a big impact, particularly Sartre, Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, that kind of literary existentialism, not the hair-splitting stuff of Heidegger and so on, but the general mood of literary existence. So that was sort of the background. And when I went to Antioch College, which, again, it drew me because of what was implicitly very left-wing politics at the campus. I knew students had been arrested in civil rights action, and I knew it had a kind of bohemian atmosphere, I guess drugs, sex, and non-conventional lifestyles. It drew me, even though I didn't quite understand why or what it was about. But once I was there, I went further down that path in terms of literary existentialism and literary leftism, sort of putting the pieces together. And while I was a radical student there, I launched a magazine on the literary, that's what you do when you're interested in literature, you have to start a magazine, right? And it was called the Antioch Masses. So again, it was somehow, I was just drawn to the old masses of the 1917 Max Eastman era, but also I knew about the new masses. I had read Writers on the Left by Daniel Lehren, and I read Richard Wright's memoir, and I had a kind of early on an understanding that this communist cultural movement around the John Reed Club and so on, that it was a kind of a dualistic thing. It was very attractive. It drew people in. It empowered people from the margins. And yet there was also something eventually that would become stultifying to Wright and the others and kind of drive them away. So that was all in the background. And by the time I got to graduate school, I was looking to do something in that area, and it was recommended to me that I look at the figure of James T. Farrell. And I remembered that my parents had some books by Farrell. I didn't know why, but on their bookshelves, short stories, and which I had read. And I read his Literature and Morality book, which is, not fiction, it's literary criticism. And I thought, this is the kind of Marxism that I like. It's flexible, creative, it's not dogmatic, and so on. So I became interested in Farrell, and he was still alive. He was sort of forgotten. This would be, let's say, 1974. He was sort of forgotten then, although later on there'd be a mini revival with a mediocre TV series of his novels and stuff. So I went to New York and met with Farrell, and he said, well, look at my archives. He'd given them to University of Pennsylvania. And through Farrell, I began to develop this connection with anti-Stalinist literary Marxists at first. And so I pursued that anti-Stalinist communist type movement up and through the well into the late 80s. And I wrote 3 books on aspects of that. But I kept being drawn back to the communist movement because I had sort of felt other people would do that, because I was really a Marxist and independent communist, but I was very critical of the Soviet Union and a lot of the communist policies on different issues, which we can get into, troubled me. So, but then I thought, well, nobody else is going to do this. So I began looking at what I first called the non-canonical, unusual communists, someone like Guy Enduar. And I began editing this series. I don't really know about that. They call the Radical Novel Reconsidered. It has about 13 books came out at the University of Illinois Press. And I did some of the introductions, and I got other scholars to do others. And that led to a bigger project around communism and writers, which I thought would be one big book, but it was so big that it ended up 3 volumes. And in the meantime, there were lots of things that I couldn't fit in for space reasons and so on. So I pursued these in essays, and I did publish 2 collections before 2000. And then in the next 22 years, I published a lot of other stuff, because I write promiscuously. I don't just write for I write for left-wing journals and so on. And so I decided to put together a kind of retrospective, not necessarily my best stuff, but a kind of representation of what I'd done since basically 2000, after the other 2 volumes came out, to the present. And that's what this Bohemian Bolsheviks volume represents.
Now, James T. Farrell was influential for figures that my listeners will probably be familiar with, such as Norman Mailer. Could you say something about James T. Farrell for the audience? I don't think that people are too familiar. Maybe this current generation is too familiar with his work. And you already mentioned, but what about his fiction? You talked about his nonfiction that drew you in, about his theories of Marxism. What's your favorite book by him, and why is he a significant literary figure on the left in America?
Well, of course, he's best known for what's called the Studs-Lonergan trilogy.
Studs-Lonergan, yeah.
That became very famous, and it did become that TV series. He regarded his major work as a pentalogy. He was very influenced by Balzac, so he had these trilogies, pentalogies.
He's working in a realist genre, right?
Well, that's part of the problem here is what labels do we use for these guys?
Right.
Usually they consider him a naturalist, but as the literary tradition using scientific perspectives on society, the heavy environment, family, biological relationships, and kind of like Emile Zola type. And that's a lot of that in Farrell. He considered himself a critical realist, which is somewhat different. And that started, it was started in the 19th century, but it involves criticism of bourgeois society, but more from a democratic perspective, different from proletarian realism and other things we can talk about. So he considered his major work the Danny O'Neill pentology, 5 volumes, and I'm kind of into that. I mean, Stalinist is important, but the pentology is the most interesting because it is autobiographical, and it was about the making of a revolutionary. So it's 5 volumes tracing this kid's whole development, very similar to Farrell's, not 100%, up to a certain point of college revolutionary activism. Great books like A World I Never Made, those wonderful titles. But then he, as you know, he underwent a political transformation in the mid-late 40s, and he switched to another trilogy. It's not so good. The Bernard Carr. It's called the Bernard Carr trilogy. First volume is called Bernard Clare, but somebody sued him, so he had to change the name. And that's kind of about a revolutionary person in crisis and so on. That's not quite finished. And then he goes into this World of Time series. So he published over 50 novels. So I don't know which one is my favorite. It's a monumental amount of work. I don't think his stature's that high at present. But again, when we get into literary judgments, we all have our personal tastes and opinions. So I got a lot out of Ferrell, and I did write my dissertation focused just on his revolutionary Marxist period as an independent Marxist influenced by Trotskyism. Since he was a pragmatist philosophically, you couldn't call him an orthodox Trotskyist or orthodox Marxist, but politically he was very close to Trotskyism up until in the middle of World War II. A lot of changes went on. So he's very important to me, and this new book is dedicated to 3 people. He's the first one, James D. Ferrell. The other is George Novak, and the third is Ernest Mandel. I had a complicated relationship to each of these, but I admired them all.
Well, it's very interesting you say George Novak, because he was the Trotskyist intellectual who ended up writing a major work refuting pragmatism in Marxism. Isn't that correct?
Yes. It did not get much attention, but it
did not. But it's a good book. I thought that it was rigorous, but it took him a long time to produce it, which I think is a testament to the difficulty of such an endeavor. But it was Trotsky's invitation to write it, and then he finally did. Right? He finally did.
Yes.
Anyways. Before we get back to the current volume, I wanted to ask you if you could offer a clarification about democratic realism and proletarian realism. Those may not be defined too precisely, but could you give us a sense of a distinction about that you just mentioned? That because I think that will come back later when we look at Steinbeck and Agnes Smedley and some of these other figures of what we might or might not call proletarian realism. I know that's a contested category, but please.
So all these literary genre types they're both helpful and dangerous. People like to subsume a writer as a naturalist, realist, social realist, socialist realist. What do they all mean? And once you put the person in that box, you tend to see them a certain way, and you miss a lot of other things. So one of the things I take up in my book is that very question, and I end up focused more on modernism as the category, even for these left writers who are often called proletarian realists and so on. The best I can do in a short time is to say that proletarian realism is a literary genre that focuses on the lives and struggles of the working class, and usually there's a socialist and communist ideology. And that's where some of the problem lies, because, who decides what is the correct socialist or communist ideology? And in the hands of the Communist Party, there were people who identified, socialist communist ideology with their current politics, which kept changing. That's a big issue here. And so it ended up being, to some extent, people who were close to the Communist Party were considered to be proletarian writers in the 1930s, who fit that mold. And usually they said that proletarian literature as a type of proletarian realism would be about working class people, and often by working class people.
Right.
Who is working class? Was Ferrell working class? Well, his father was working class, but he was raised in a middle class family because the poor family could not afford. So, that there's a lot of complications.
Right.
So often this literature is referred of the 30s referred to as social realism, which is a broader category. And then and a lot of different artistic styles can be social realism, but it's not tied to a specific ideology. It's broader, dealing with life and troubles of working people and other people outside the working class. Probably most left literature in the 30s, I think you would probably call social realism. Realism itself is just simply portraying life against romantic idealizations, which had predominated in earlier literature. Ordinary, everyday experiences, realistic speech and behavior, and so on. Romanticism is about the imagination, emotions, fantasy, supernatural, stuff like that. Then you have socialist realism. So that's the official cultural doctrine of the Soviet Union.
Right.
Sometimes people say, well, American writers were socialist realists. But the point of socialist realism was to portray an idealized life under socialism in the Soviet Union. So it didn't really apply to American writers because they were writing about American capitalism, not the Soviet Union. And I should say, there's a lot of interesting stuff in socialist realism. If you read In Quiet Flows of Dawn, it's quite a remarkable, the author was, a bunch of hack, but he wrote magnificent literature. So even socialist realism is worth looking at.
Now let's talk about a couple examples here. Let's talk about Mike Gold, who I think he wrote Jews Without Money. He's a very interesting figure. You've written about his work. And let's throw the other example of, say, Agnes Smedley and maybe even Jack London. Seems to me that those three examples of American writers are proletarian realism in some sense, is in the sense that they're trying to galvanize something like a class consciousness on behalf of a working class readership, right? As well as point to the contradictions of bourgeois society in their work, right? We can talk more specifically about the case of Smedley, who you have a whole section on in Bohemian Bolsheviks, which I think she's a fascinating figure, especially when you look at the contradictions of her biography and how it plays out in Daughter of Earth. There's a lot of contradictions there. But might they qualify as part of proletarian realism in an American tradition or something along those lines? Is that fair to say? Or are there other writers you might add as exemplary here?
Yeah, they all have a connection to proletarian realism in a sense that they're trying to get at ordinary experience, working class life. And there's obviously some kind of socialist ideology involved. But, once you get up close, it's much more complicated. Let me just start with Mike Gold, because he's the main one I really worked on in terms of both literature and politics.
Please.
Smedley, I was mostly concerned with politics. Jack London's somebody I've read, but I've not done original research into his life and so on. So Gold, often referred to as the father of proletarian literature. There's a 2-volume dissertation called that, which has some impact and so on. And he's frequently cited. However, if you look at Mike Gold closely, his major works of the 1920s, which were mostly these avant-garde plays in the New Playwrights Theater, which he ran with Dos Passos and John Howard Lawson, are very surrealistic and fantastical, and they involve race issues and some class issues, but the technique and style is ultra modernist, way out there. Then you get the Jews Without Money. Where are the proletarians in Jews Without Money? The main character's father is a house painter, and has a kind of a small business and so on. And is that proletarian life? There are no unions in it. There is a doctor character who's cheering for the unions, hurrah for the unions. 90% of the characters in Jews Without Money are lumpen. Main character is a gangster whose name is the N-word, which I won't use, a Jewish gangster kid who's dark-skinned and so on. There are pimps and prostitutes and so on. At the very end, the main character watches a speech at a rally, probably someone like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn speaking or whatever, and says, "Hurrah, I'm converted to the revolution," and so on. So is that proletarian literature? It's not unions. It's not, work experience and so on. And in fact, he was denounced by other members of the John Reed Club for being a kind of bohemian, not serious writer who didn't really write about workers. There's a review in The Nation by a leader of the John Reed Club. At that time, he's now forgotten. He was a playwright, and denounces Gold in those terms in The Nation as non-proletarian. So Gold was politically very far left and so on. But in terms of when you get up close to the literature, it just doesn't really fit into that. And I do regard Gold and many of the proletarian writers as essentially modernist writers in terms of trying to create new forms of literature, new experiments, different kind of vocabulary. And of course, at Gold, there's a lot of Jewish ethnic stuff going on. So I think that's the case with a lot of these people.
Yeah. How does this might link up to another area that you talk about in Bohemian Bolsheviks, which is African American cultural workers and radical writers? There is a sort of tradition that you're contributing to, and I sort of wanted to ask you what kind of contribution your book is making to a broader understanding of African American literature, and how it too speaks to something like a proletarian experience, right? Colored by race, of course, but could you maybe connect the African American dimension here, and obviously point to some examples, if you would, of authors?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, when we talk about radical literature and literature that's linked to promoting the working class with working class writers, and so it's very multi-ethnic. But there is a special element of African American and Jewish American literature that's part of this. I mean, there's a lot of interesting Farrell, Irish American, and Carlos Bulosan, Filipino, and H.T. Chang, Chinese American. There's a lot of other stuff, but there's numerically and in terms of national impact, African American and Jewish American are sort of in the vanguard of this whole movement. So from the beginning, of course, I was fascinated with Richard Wright, and he's sort of emblematic of this complicated role because the stereotype again of the Marxist proletarian pro-communist writers is class against class. But of course, Wright always emphasized the race color aspect of the situation, and there's you could compare him to John Steinbeck. We can talk more about Steinbeck, who probably wasn't a party member, but politically very close and so on. He eventually is somebody who focused on class against class and eliminates color and race. He has some early stories about race, but by the time of Grapes of Wrath, it's widely criticized for the fact that it's all white. Whereas Richard Wright, who is a party member up and clearly until 42 and doesn't say anything outside the party until 44, he increasingly emphasizes color and race. So when Native Son comes out at the same time as Grapes of Wrath, you can see that Native Son is kind of a racial critique of communism, and raises very complicated questions that infuriated and tore apart the communist movement, because they had widespread debates and disagreements. Mike Gold did defend Richard Wright, but Benjamin Davis and others harshly criticized him. So Wright is an example of the reality of the experience of racism, violating the stereotypes, and everything about Wright's life and behavior kind of confirms my argument in Bohemian Bolsheviks that there's this image that comes forward of the left-wing proletarian writer, and it sometimes is also promoted by the communist movement itself, but it has nothing to do with a lived reality of the writer-artist, which contradicts and violates all these confusing stereotypes.
Is this why biography emerges as so significant in your studies of literary figures? Because let's take the example of Smedley, Agnes Smedley, who wrote Daughter of Earth. the portrayal of the Ludlow strike throughout the early part of the novel is very vivid and monstrous. And one of the strategies of proletarian realism was, in fact, to, I think, exaggerate or to maybe make hyperbolic so as to galvanize consciousness of working class experience and conditions and suffering. And so her family is portrayed as the workers who are facing possible annihilation from the cops in the uprising. And then when you look at her biography, you learn that, in fact, her father was one of the police who was suppressing the workers.
Yeah.
Right? So that doesn't necessarily bother me too much, because I can buy into the logic of the objective of the novel, putting aside whether we feel that this is well, let me just pose it as a question. How do you manage biographical contradictions in realist portrayals of novels and things of that nature? How does that work for you? And of course, gender and sexuality is another site where the contradictions of biography become quite illuminating. So could you speak more broadly to, I know you write a lot about biography and you've thought a lot about biography. And I also wanted to ask you, as a secondary question, what makes a good biography? Because one of the things you say as a side point is that at a certain point in time, the Communist Party encouraged the propagation of biography, as a political, cultural object. So how does biography fit into your analysis here?
Well, I don't consider myself a biographer in the sense that I don't do complete biographies of people, soup to nuts, cradle to grave type thing. But I do use biographical material in looking at the question of commitment. That's the main thing that I've always focused on. What exactly is political commitment involved, and how much of it is altruistic, and how much of it is self-serving, and how much of it is real, and how much of it is a persona that you have. And all these things tie into the left-wing commitment. Which of course I'm favorable toward and support, but I think it's a mistake to have be completely naive and see these people as saints. So yeah, there's a lot of fabrication in the way these left writers presented themselves. One of my favorites is that if you have the original edition of Alexander Saxton's, he's a wonderful proletarian writer, The Great Midland. He later became a UCLA history professor. On the book jacket, you see Alex and his he's wearing a working man's shirt and looks like a very proletarian kind of guy. But if you read his background, he was like the son of one of the major editors of publishing companies. He went to fancy prep schools. He went to Harvard. He went to the University of Chicago. He did eventually proletarianize himself, and he wants that image for himself in his novel. But it's kind of misleading. And this happens with a lot of people. And of course, right, they have to sort of clean up their personal lives. Too, many of them had, of course, many were gay and lesbians, which is part of the radical movement, radical cultural movement, literature, and so on. But they certainly didn't advertise that, and you can find it in their literature if you're aware of it and you look for it, and so on. And then there's all the personal stuff: broken marriages, betrayals, all that agony. Just sibling rivalry. I mean, this is all in the background of most people, and it's there in artistic work because almost every writer draws heavily on their personal lives to some extent, not on one-on-one exact replication, but a little bit from this parent, a little bit from that uncle, a little from they draw from this. Yeah, that's clearly the case. Many times with radical writers, that's put aside. You don't want to go into all the marriages, divorces, affairs, betrayal, all of James D. Farrell or Mike Gold or whatever. They focus on the ideology. You say somebody's a Marxist writer, and so the person looks for Marxism and looks for the Marxist ideology and looks for this, looks for that, based on the politics, which could be in there, but there's just a lot more. So someone like Smedley, who, does interest me because of the way her biography was fabricated by herself, and then the mistakes made by that first couple that wrote the major biography of Smedley, who were actually, one of them was related to Smedley. I don't think they meant any harm, but they just couldn't see the real Agnes Smedley. So my essay on Smedley in the volume is a comparison of that with a second biography, which is completely different because it's fact-based. The first biography took Daughter of Earth as if it was accurate because it is an autobiographical novel, which, you know, most scholars would realize is always a hybrid of fiction and memory and constructed memory and so on.
Right.
But they took a lot of it as fact. And the second biographer challenged just about everything. There are problems in the second biography in terms of figuring out a lot of the sources.
By McKinnon?
Not the McKinnon one, but the second.
The more recent one?
Yeah. Who was by a radical woman who was Bella Abzug's assistant for many years. She's somebody on the left and sympathetic to Smedley, but she shows a completely different side of Smedley. Much more interesting. I mean, maybe it's just a personal quirk, but I happen to be more as interested in portraits of people that show their contradictions and human weaknesses.
Right.
Because I have a few human weaknesses myself.
Right.
So, in any event, so this is crucial on an individual basis to understand a particular artist and a relationship to their art. But I think to the radical movement as a whole, it doesn't help to have a falsified, idealistic picture of the movement that doesn't fully represent the mistakes that were made, because that means you're going to repeat those mistakes. So to honor that tradition, we have to see a total picture.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. And, you know, people can look at my interview with Stephen McKinnon on Smedley. Obviously, one of the interesting things about Smedley is her time in China. And she wrote a biography of Zhu Di, the general of the Red Army, Mao's top general, which I'm sure you're aware of, and even had escapades with Mao Zedong himself in the caves when she was a journalist following the Red Army. Very fascinating life. Time in Berlin, underwent psychoanalysis, most likely bisexual, contradictions, but also possibly a Russian agent. Quite a life, right?
A Russian spy in terms of spying on the Nazis. No evidence of spying in the U.S. So I think that's
true.
That comes up. So the McKinnons say, well, she didn't spy in the U.S. She wasn't a spy, but she did spy against the Nazis. Nothing wrong with that. She spied against the Japanese. Nothing wrong with that. You know.
I want to ask you about the element of Jewish working class writers that interest you. We talked about Mike Gold, but there seems to be a kind of common point. Obviously, the legacy of the 48ers and the generation of New York Jewish intellectuals and the New York intellectuals, on the one hand, were captivated by Trotskyism, and they also created the vanguard of an anti-Stalinist position, which interests you a great deal. And I really like your book on the New York intellectuals. Can you tell my listeners perhaps a little bit about that book on the New York intellectuals, the Jewish dimension of these figures, and just introduce why Trotskyism was so appealing to these figures?
Yeah. So when I first got into the subject of what became the New York intellectuals, and part of my argument is that label is a post-war label. And when people apply to the 30s and so on, it's kind of misleading because there's a big transformation. They're originally anti-Stalinist, Marxist, radical students and writers and so on in the 30s. And later on, as they changed, they became known as the New York intellectuals. But they're very different. Originally, I was drawn to the subject because of my interest in anti-Stalinist Marxism, that is critique of Stalinism and communists, but from an anti-communist view. I am anti-communist because my perspective is sympathetic to communism, but I see Stalinism as a historically produced aberration. I don't see Stalinism as the cause of every evil. As Trotsky, the thing about Trotsky's argument that Stalinism was a product of a horrible situation is more convincing to me. I'm not an orthodox Trotskyist, but there's a lot in Trotsky that I agree with and admire. So that was a start. But when I started looking into the origins of these intellectuals, George Novak, in fact, who I'd met as a college student, he came to speak at Antioch College, and I was up all night talking to him. He had mentioned that the first group were writers for this Menorah journal, including people who later became famous like Lionel Chilling, Elliot Cohn, who founded Commentary, and Herbert Solow, crucial person. Novak was on the fringes of this because his first wife, whose name was Hayes, or her married name was Rice, Eleanor Rice, was the best friend of Diana Trilling and close to the Trillings and so on. So he told me about this. And so I went to the library and began reading this thing called the Menorah Journal, and became completely fascinated by it. And, I often wonder about this because, I was raised in the Jewish tradition. My father was founding president of his synagogue and stuff like that. But I wasn't much into Jewish community activities or anything like that. I certainly was affected by the Holocaust. And it was all my life I've thought, we can't let this Holocaust thing happen to anybody else. That was what I got out of it. Which is why I'm drawn to anti-Zionism. So I read this journal and I saw how they evolved from a kind of Jewish cultural pluralism. They want to normalize Judaism. They wanted to talk about, from a Jewish point of view, other things and so on, toward communism and Marxism in the late 1920s, and then how they progressed through an encounter with the Communist Party, and how they found that the Communist Party's practice in the United States kept changing and was contradicting their values, and they evolved toward Trotskyism, and some of them did become Trotskyists, although, again, Trotskyism is not the whole story. We're talking about dissident communism, something broader. There's Bukharism, council communism, other idiosyncratic, but Trotskyism did play a special role because of Trotsky's critique of the Soviet Union. So I followed this group, and actually, that was the beginning of my dissertation, not Farrell. And I wrote this piece about the Menorah Journal. I still consider it one of my best pieces, although it was a graduate student work called The Menorah Journal That Moves Left. But, at that time I was in the Berkeley English department. There was no Jewish studies there. There were a couple of Jewish faculty who were very good. They all taught British literature. And I did go to the one well-known Jewish professor in Comp Lit named Robert Alter, who was quite conservative, actually. I went to him with my Marxist essay, and he was nice to me. And he said, publish that in Jewish social studies. But he didn't encourage me to go into Jewish American literature. There was really nobody at Berkeley, this is 1973, to work with. So I published that, and then I moved over to Ferrell because that's something that would be supported. So from that moment on, I saw there was something in this Jewish evolution toward internationalism. That's what attracted me, that they were Jews. They didn't deny they were Jews, but they weren't obsessed with it. And I saw that the solution to anti-Semitism was to an internationalist vision and allying with other oppressed groups.
Yeah.
Not, going to the Holy Land and building a fortress and then, attacking all kinds of other countries and expropriating the indigenous population. But it was through solidarity with other oppressed groups. And that's what drew me. And so it did produce that book, The New York Intellectuals, in which the Jewish presence is very, very strong. Again, it's other people, Dwight McDonald, who I knew, and Mary McCarthy I interviewed, and other people, and of course Ferrell comes up in it too. So it's not reductive to Judaism, but the Jewish presence in that book is very strong, the Jewish internationalist presence. And so that's why I was kind of horrified when in working on this, I got to the 40s and into the 50s, and I saw a transformation in this group toward the right, betraying what was so wonderful and so promising in the early partisan review and things like that. So that's kind of the background of the book.
Have you written? You write a lot about commitment, and I think for other scholars listening to this interview, they can learn something about this singular focus of your life's work being around this motif or this idea of commitment, what it means. I wanted to ask you just briefly, have you written much about betrayal? Because it seems to me that one scratches their head when looking at a lot of figures from this period, from Sidney Hook to James Burnham to this whole Trotskyist to neocon pipeline after the 67 war, for example. In a certain way, you could make a sort of straightforward account. Well, it's sort of world events that account for betrayal of communist commitments. But have you dug in deeper to this question of how people betray their commitments, how they betray their radical commitments, out of curiosity? Or is that not something you've yet written about?
No, I had to write about it because I call it de-radicalization, or maybe apostasy. I tend not to use the words betrayal or renegade. I've used renegade maybe in quotes, but I generally see it as de-radicalization. That's a big phenomenon. I mean, you notice recently when David Horowitz died, there were 100 obituaries and tributes to David Horowitz. People are fascinated that it's left to right. I mean, this is a guy who started out, in a communist family with communist ideas as a teenager and college student. And then he sort of became more of an independent Marxist, influenced briefly by Deutscher. And then he was sort of pro Ramparts, Black Panther. And then he started to de-radicalize in the late 20th century. At first, he was moving a little bit to the right, more to the right. And then the guy ends up kind of a miniature Whittaker Chambers with his book exposing professors. And then at the end, he's a Trump idolater.
Right.
It's kind of, there's a lot of interest in it because it's not unusual. Not every radical does this. In fact, I just reviewed 4 books by radicals of my generation who stayed to the end, or stayed to the end in their late 70s. Tariq Ali, David Rodiger, and Walden Bellow and Helena Sheehan. I just did a kind of review.
What's the name of that work? Does that have a name, a title?
Well, I've just submitted it to a journal. So
that you've written.
Yeah, I just wrote this review of all these wrestling with this. Why did these guys stay to the end? Yeah. David Horowitz goes the other way.
Brilliant.
I've called it Lions in Winter. I hope it's published soon. Anyway,
good for you.
I think that you can't reduce it to simply sell out. Although, with someone like Horowitz, the financial rewards, when you switch from left to right and you're prominent, there's a lot of rewards are waiting for you. There's no question about that. But, there has to be more than that. And I think one thing is that genuine crises occur that force people to rethink. And certainly for this New York intellectuals group, it was everything that happened in the 40s. That is, the ones who were pro-Trotskyist had this mistaken Trotskyist view that World War II was going to produce another social revolution similar to World War I. Stalinism would be overthrown by an upheaval, and the United States capitalism would crumble, the working class would rise, and so on. Actually, there was a little of that. There was a post-war working class upsurge, and there were revolutions in China and Yugoslavia and so on, but they were deformed or whatever. They didn't come out the way you had hoped. So there was reason to rethink. But why did they rethink in the way that they did, which meant abandoning the general revolutionary socialist perspective that had, given them a vision and made them critical thinkers and so on? They made the wrong choices. And I think we keep seeing that happening again. So, for my generation, a lot of these younger radicals of the 68 types like myself, they believed there was going to be a social revolution in the late 20th century. I never believed that, fortunately, but and when they saw it wasn't happening, they began to rethink their lives and see other routes to fulfillment and so on. With the Attack on the World Trade Center, another group, if you're familiar with it, the Euston Manifesto, were very anxious to, these were very prominent people led by Norman Juras, who was a major British Marxist and had written wonderful stuff. All of a sudden they decided, well, the left doesn't understand Islam and so on. They're naive. We have to defend the West. Again, there was reason to rethink in light of these kinds of world historic events. But why they rethink in the direction they did, is the question. And I think it's because there was not a powerful left that kept an alternative vision alive. I mean, we need a left that's not static. We have to rethink things. A lot of things that I thought in terms of the need for a Marxist party and so on are in question now. What do we need? A new kind of socialist movement? What should be the basis? Yeah, a lot of difficult rethinking, but to revert to the earlier positions, which is what all these people did. I mean, David Horowitz's evolution was not towards some higher level of more complicated, when he had the Second Thoughts conference, the Second Thoughts was about retreat to the pro-capitalism, pro-Western ideology that had repelled them in their youth. And that so many of these people are becoming the people they hated and despised in their youth. So some of it involves circumstances. Everything in life is contingent. I'm sure the fact that I've remained, far left, it has to do with certain contingent things in my life. It has to do with personality, character. We're all shaped by our parents to some degree. It has to just a lot of factors involved. So generalizations about sellout, I don't use.
Yeah.
Although people have accused me of saying that, but I've never. You won't find it. It has to be individually based, and it has to be largely biographically based too. As in all my work, the biography thing is not a total explanation, but it's indispensable component.
Beautiful. I wanted to ask you about your essay reflecting on 100 years of communism in America, which I think was published in 2019.
Yes.
So that's incredible. 100 years. And here we are, relatively short time frame if you think about it. Now, one of the concepts you say here is that we need to decisively unfable communism, and you then interrogate the CPUSA, and you think that in a certain sense, a lot more. I think you're making an invitation that more research should be done on the evolution of the CPUSA. It's the way that it evolved. And I wanted to ask you, and also in a moment, I'm going to introduce sort of alternatives to that in the form of James P. Cannon, who becomes a figure that seems to organize a form of party that, at least for some period of time, is much more conducive to the type of revolutionary socialist tradition that you think we need. Talk about the frustrations that emerge when you're looking at the origin of communism in America. First of all, maybe you could tell us, everyone has seen Warren Beatty's Reds,
Yes,
where it's portrayed, I think, very nicely. But maybe you could rehearse for a moment this founding moment, where these tendencies spawn off to, and how the CPUSA, at least from a cultural standpoint, adopts Browderism, right? And how that becomes quite deleterious and quite unthinking and inflexible, ultimately.
Yeah. But, well, the whole question of communism, to me, it's a major question. There's 50 books on it, and I've written a lot of reviews. I just reviewed recently the Morris Isserman book, and the new book on Claudia Jones is a very important figure, and the book on communism in California, which is really quite interesting. I reviewed them in a labor history journal, and I've done a lot of other reviews too. That particular piece on 100 years of communism, yeah, that's really a think piece. It's pretty complicated. In fact, I did have some trouble publishing it first because people thought, well, it's too complicated. An ordinary journal isn't going to understand this. So I did publish it Against the Current. It's a journal that I'm a co-editor of, and it does require a higher level of sophistication and understanding. So I on this question of the origins of communism, of course, it's a left-wing split from the Socialist Party, and it's a very fractured split because there are, several different factions. One very foreign language heavy, and then there's the John Reed Gitlow faction, which I agree with you. Reds is a fantastic film. I mean, Warren Beatty seems like kind of an idiot, but somehow the writers and produce and all those talking heads many of them are that are not named and not knowns, but they're quite interesting people and so on. So it was the left wing, and it was attracted toward the Russian Revolution, which inspired and transformed. It's a critical moment in the history of Marxism, although it, of course, has complicated outcomes, not all of which are positive. The new book, Karl Marx in America by Andrew Hartman, kind of treats that moment very well. This is a 400-page tome. It's also very complicated, but it's definitely worth taking a look at. So out of that left wing, there was all the factionalism and so on. And the truth is that the intervention of the Comintern, the Russians, was largely positive in the 20s. I mean, later we think of the American Communist Party as, being the lapdog of Moscow and so on. But at that moment, the things that Moscow recommended, like, come out from the underground. The original communists were underground, I don't know what they thought was going to happen here, but they were not an open party. The Comintern urged them to become above ground. And the Comintern pushed an understanding of African American liberation in terms of the colonial question, which becomes very important. It can have a crude reading, but generally to see African Americans as an oppressed nationality with many similarities to the colonial experience, even though it's an internal colonial and they colonized people are kidnapped from the west coast of Africa and so on. It still resonates. That's why Frantz Fanon becomes such an important figure. He really theorizes all that on a world scale. So the communist movement actually benefited, I think, in the early period from its association with the Comintern. But as the Russian Revolution began to decline and degenerate, which unfortunately happens with a lot of revolutions in peasant-based countries without much of a working class, surrounded by enemies, and a Stalin regime emerged from this horrible situation, things changed. And when the Communist International began expelling all oppositions in the late 30s, starting with the Lovestone, and Lovestone himself became a kind of a monster in defense of U.S. imperialism. The Lovestonites and the Trotskyists and many others were expelled. Then you're in a new situation of the Communist Party becoming more and more dependent on Moscow for its leadership and direction and so on. And, eventually into the 30s, it's clear that as far as foreign policy goes, you can't be in or around the Communist Party if you disagree with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union keeps changing its politics. You can point to many different areas where this becomes problematic. But let's just say that on the race question, the Communist Party was terrific in the 1930s. So many young scholars, they look to the 30s and they think, wow, that's the Communist Party. That's my ideal. And I was like that when I first started out. But then you follow what happens during the World War II period, and it's just the opposite. Because of subordination to the Soviet Union, they reversed themselves on the race question. Because of the World War II. Now, first during the Hitler-Stalin pact, Hitler's is no different from England. Jews have no stake in this. For no war, blah blah blah. Once the Soviet Union is attacked by Hitler, then everything changes and everything is subordinated to whatever it will defend the Soviet Union and alliance with the Roosevelt regime, 100%, 200%. So when Pearl Harbor occurs, the Communist Party expels its Japanese American members, expels them. And then when internment happens, they completely support internment. They tell all their Japanese American sympathizers, go to the concentration camps. And when the African American community launches Double V to both fight against racism and against fascism, the Communist Party opposes it. It's disruptive. And they didn't carry on a fight against the segregated military. Everything about African Americans had to be subordinated to the war effort. When rebellions broke out in the northern cities over clearly racist incidents in New York and Detroit and Los Angeles with the Zoot Suit riots, the communist press says these are caused by Hitler. Hitler gave orders for the Detroit Rebellion. Hitler gave orders for the Harlem Rebellion, blah, 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 because the war is good for Black America. So everything gets reversed. So you have to see the total picture of American communism, the wonderful, heroic, magnificent things, and then the disturbing, problematic things. which are connected with subordination to the Soviet Union. And there's just too many scholars who are kind of fixated on the first, and they think that talking about the left gives ammunition to the enemy, it plays into anti-communism, blah, blah, blah. But if you want to build a new socialist movement in the United States that builds upon the sacrifices that the American communists made, you have to tell the whole story so the mistakes are not repeated. And this problem of idealizing struggles in other countries or governments of other countries because they're anti-imperialist or because they say they're socialist and not seeing what they're doing to their own population, that continues to be a problem on the left, and it'll continue to create a kind of polarized situation where a lot of people can't accept the far left, and we have to build a left that's much, much broader and more understanding and informed. And I think that looking at this history, I mean, a lot of young people say, well, I'm not invested in these old debates. I don't want to hear about Stalin, you know. It's not that you're wanting to go back to the past and refight, you know, these old fights, you know, like a dog returning to its vomit or something. There are patterns of thought that do reoccur, and that you have to deal with and have to confront in order to sort of rid the left culture of these negative things.
What was the cultural and aesthetic production of the Communist Party under its Stalinist period? And are there pieces of work or writers that fell into that and cooperated ideologically that are of note, or rather, is the cultural and aesthetic production of American communism under its kind of Stalinist control periods represent a sort of poverty of interesting artistic production, etc.? I know that you talked a lot about how they tried to commission biographies, for example. And I know that a lot of writers are not easily classifiable, right? Could you talk about that? Were they at all successful in commissioning writers or developing or nurturing writers, or maybe not so successful? And if not, why?
You know, on the whole, I have a positive attitude toward communist cultural production, even into the 50s. And a kind of the afterlife of the communist experience even more. I am especially fascinated with people who leave the communist movement, but retain their Marxism and socialism and try to return, and particularly a book like The Narrows by Ann Petrie completely obsesses me, or Between the Hills and the Sea. These are not well-known novels, you know, but the ones that have most impacted me. And Abraham Polanski's novel, The World Above, about Marxist psychoanalysts, that also completely fascinates me. So, generally speaking, my view is that the communist movement did uplift a generation of writers who might have been neglected or never had a chance. It gave them a community. It gave them a venue for publication, especially the case with African-American writers and Jewish writers in the working class and so on. It uplifted them, but it also tried to limit and control them to some extent. And if you read like the New Masses, there is a lot of fascinating, interesting stuff in the New Masses, but you'll also see that some of the reviews are just unbelievably critical on political grounds, that it didn't include. Well, let's take Ann Petrie, because she's like one of my major figures. When she publishes The Street, you know, The Street is an incredible novel. I'm more of The Narrows obsessed, but The Street is also magnificent. They criticized The Street because she didn't have the presence of left-wing forces in Harlem. You don't see the church as a progressive force. You don't see any trade unions. It's all gangsters and oppression and so on. And she did that as an intentional strategy because she wanted to confront people with an absence and make people think, well, it would be different if there were interracial solidarity and unions. So she left it out, but they attacked her simply for leaving it out and not including, the alternative. And that's one of the most common criticisms of everybody. I mean, Nathaniel West is criticized for that. All kinds of great writers are criticized for that. So that's a problematic downside. And eventually, a lot of writers, I think, got sick of that and tired of that. But in the early period, they were uplifted and given a vision, and it really enhanced their work. And very few communist writers really stayed with them to the end. I mean, it's amazing the number who were either party members. If you look at theater, I mean, the ones who were party members or who were around the party, even Tennessee Williams was around the party. It doesn't make sense at first, but if you look at his early career, you'll see, pro-communist themes. Lillian Hellman was a party Miller. So Arthur Miller, I've done a lot of work on Miller. Definitely pro-communist, probably in a writer's unit, probably a young communist here at University of Michigan and so on. Very important to his whole life and development. But who stuck with it to the end? 3 or 4 people. Walter Lowenfels, although Lowenfels is still interesting. I like Walter Lowenfels. Philip Banatsky. So some people would see him as kind of a super Stalinist, Fosterite, whatever. His novels are quite interesting. The 2 major ones that are published and some unpublished stuff. So it's quite a record. But on a whole, I'm positive toward it, and I'm interested in preserving it by confronting and exorcising the deformations and the problems. And that's why my work tends to be a little more complicated than people want to see.
I wanted to ask you about the masses and then later the new masses as a publication on the American left. Could you speak broadly about its importance, its distribution, maybe if you have any understanding of that? It's one of the questions I would always wonder. And as a side point, people can look at the digitized versions. They're freely available on the internet, and they're beautiful. Beautiful meaning that they're funny and they're interesting, and just from the standpoint of how, just as a study of how socialists and communists used to try to communicate to a working class readership is very interesting. Because the new masses, would you categorize some of that as almost like an American prolecult sort of orientation to doing cultural criticism? It seems as if, because it emerges right after World War I, and it constitutes a big shift from the earlier version of the publication, which was called The Masses. Could you illuminate the significance of the masses and the new masses for us?
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously the new masses was just a freewheeling bohemian ultra-revolutionary publication. I mean, nobody should think, oh, well, they were just reformed socialists and so on. They were close to the IWW, the left wing, and most of the editors became sympathetic to the communist movement and launched the Liberator and I think it was a Workers' Monthly or whatever it was in the 20s. That eventually morphed into the new masses in the late 20s, which was not communist, quote unquote, controlled, but in the orbit of the Communist Party. And in general, I think it's a mistake to think about the new masses, even by the early 30s, as being simply communist control. It's not like somebody was out there giving orders, do this, do that, and everybody fell in line. A communist commitment is a voluntary commitment. You make yourself. You want to be part of the communist movement. You want to follow the line because you agree with it, or you think that promoting the line in a party is good for America, good for world socialism, and so on. So it's a voluntary kind of association, but it can get pretty close. And many of the staff members of the new masses were not technically party members. I've in my 3 volumes, I identify certain people that were not party members. Some people who were super dogmatic, I don't want to name too many names here, but were actually not in the party. I mean, that's one thing you have to understand, is just because you're in the party, it doesn't mean that you're a dogmatic fanatic. And just because you're out of party doesn't mean you're like independent minded. And so a lot of the sympathizers were more fanatic than those inside the party, who are more complicated. So there's a transition period in the late 20s and early 30s where the new masses is practically anarchist run. Again, I document some of this and some of the things that went on and some of the confusions. But by, let's say, approaching the Popular Front, it becomes more and more run by a group of people who want to follow the party positions. And then that evolves into the 40s, where there's this famous debate called the Maltz Affair. And a very good scholar, Patrick Chura, is writing a book about Albert Maltz, which should be quite helpful. But where in the period after Browder's expel, this is interesting. It's people, because they think Browder, he's the great liberator. He wanted a not less, more Americanized. And so after Browder's expel, there's kind of a desire to open up and expand the new masses, led by one of the editors, important guy named Isidor Schneider. And he writes an essay opening up discussion, and Albert Maltz writes this thing saying, the slogan "art as a weapon," that can be abused. It may be a weapon in some complicated way, but it lends itself towards simplistic political judgments. He mentions Farrell. He says, Farrell writes some interesting stuff. He's a bad guy because he's a Trotskyite, but so he gets jumped on and has to repudiate himself. But you see, there's still a kind of flexibility in debate and so on. People did defend Maltz and were disappointed when he capitulated and so on. And by the late 40s, it is pretty thin. Now, they do launch this magazine called Mainstream, which is worth looking at. It is beautifully done with a lot of writers, including Alexander Saxton in it, who later become important, and some very interesting essays. Even when the criticism is when the boundaries of Zdanovism, which is a kind of Stalinist cultural policy during the war years, there's still a lot of intelligent stuff going on. There's a guy named Charles Humboldt, who's a poet I find completely fascinating. His real name was Nathan Weinstein. In any event, there are people who are doing some really great work. And by the way, Humboldt goes on to become the cultural editor of The Guardian. He does a book with a communist years later and does interesting critique. So anyway, there's stuff in there. So you have to accept the negative, contours and so on, but with a lot of interesting stuff at the heart.
So does Browder represent a kind of deterioration of cultural production in sort of the American communist scene, in your opinion? And also, could you introduce Browderism to the audience who may or may not be familiar with Earl Browder and his role? He was, as you say, a kind of Stalinist figure that had a huge bureaucratic power in the American government, but he was a sort of direct agent of Moscow. Also sort of like a kind of patriotic socialist, I suppose. My question to you is, how did Browderism affect art? And you kind of mentioned some of that before, but maybe anything more on that? Because in your essay, Browder's a profound sort of stain on the movement, right?
Well, yeah. Again, it's this question of the myth. The myth of Browder is that he was a right-wing communist, and he did, in fact, dissolve the Communist Party into the Communist Political Association. But, you have to remember that because of the culture they built up in the communist movement around leaders, which again is something I would love to see the American left do away with, but a kind of hero worship of their leaders and idealized and so on. He was very, very influential. He drew gigantic crowds. He was seen as, an American hero. They had stories about his family lineage going back to the revolution and blah, blah, blah. And he did promote culture in a broad sense, and he dropped the kind of proletarian culture emphasis for a people's culture.
Right.
Originally in the literary left, people like Kenneth Burke, a famous literary critic, raised the question, why are we doing proletarian? The Americans don't use that word. They don't know what you're talking about, proletarian literature or proletarian revolution. Use people. And he was denounced and, heavily criticized for that kind of vision. But then Browder came along and, it's the Popular Front. We want a people's culture, people's literature, people's songs, people's this, which kind of diluted. Andrew Hartman's book I mentioned is pretty strong on this, about the dilution of Marxism during the Popular Front period. So it seems like he's opening up things. Of course, you're still excluded if you're critical of Soviet foreign policy. It's stuff about the Popular Front unifying everybody against fat. If you're critical of what's going on in the Moscow trials, which is like the destruction of the cadres of the Bolshevik Revolution, then you're excluded. So Popular Front unity isn't quite what some people want to think it is. But Browder did champion that, and and he moved everything to the right. I mean, you can see that at first they were sort of critically supporting the FDR. Then by 38, they sort of see themselves within the New Deal. And then eventually Browder has the illusion that he's influencing Roosevelt. I don't think that's true, but he sort of thinks that. I think he becomes carried away with his own, illusions of grandeur, which happens, unfortunately, much too often. And this gets more and more to the point where he somehow reads the Popular Front turns into the National Front during the war. He reads that as leading to post-war complete coexistence between the working class and capitalism. And he thinks he's going to be in the government or something. I don't know, but he sees post-war peace going on forever. And then, of course, Moscow does yet another turnabout, and the Cold War begins to be launched, and the Duclos letter, a French communist writes a letter about Browder's betrayal, but it's at the behest of Moscow. I think everybody agrees. And then Browder's expelled, and all the problems, some of these terrible things I mentioned in terms of CP policy during World War II on race, they're all blamed on Browder. Everybody supported Browder, but nobody voted against it. Well, maybe Foster had some doubts, but everything is blamed on Browder. And even today, some people say, yeah, all the problems are Browder. And then the Communist Party reconstitutes itself as a left force again. The Communist Party is, reformed and so on. And then they go into the whole Cold War period, which is a really tough times. And they do take some problematic positions then too, but they fought hard against the Cold War. You have to give credit for that.
I appreciate that background. I want to also ask you, for the benefit of my listeners as well, to introduce a figure that, I think there's a large new biography written on this figure of James P. Cannon. He's an important figure for you, I think. That's the impression I get. I want to ask you why he's important for you. One of the things that you note is that you're interested in the type of intellectuals that are drawn to his party, the SWP, right? And could you give us a snapshot of who he is, why he's an important figure on the American left, and what sort of figures are drawn to Cannon, and give us a sort of lay of the land of the Cannon movement and presence?
Yeah, as you point out, there is a superb Canadian scholar named Brian Palmer, who has written a lot of interesting books, but he's written 2 volumes, what I think will be a 3-volume history of Cannon, and the second volume is incredibly long and detailed. Although, for someone like me, it's fascinating. I don't know what the general public will see. And so he's trying to restore Cannon as a central figure in American radical history.
Right.
I think Cannon's important. I have to say, although I admire Palmer tremendously, I think he's got an exaggerated idea of the importance of Orthodox Trotskyism. As I've emphasized, I came to appreciate Trotskyism from an existentialist, kind of new left position. And probably I've always been more drawn to anti-colonial type intellectuals like Franz Fanon and so on than I have been to Bolshevik intellectuals, although, they're interesting, Bukharin, Trotsky, and so on. It's not as central to me as it is to him.
I see.
And he's very much involved in seeing Cannon as a major figure and as an Orthodox Trotskyist, Orthodox Leninist, Orthodox everything. So I have some, differences, but I have tremendous admiration for what he's doing. So Cannon is one of the historic figures of American communism. He grew up in an IWW left socialist background, was part of the John Reed Gitlow Americanized wing of the Socialist Party that founded communism, rose through the ranks to a pretty central figure in the 1920s. There was a Foster Cannon faction and all that. Went to Moscow and received some sort of underground documents by Trotsky. Well, they weren't, as Trotsky was being purged, and agreed with them. Came back to the United States with another figure of great importance, Maurice Spector, and sort of introduced Trotskyism into the communist movement, was expelled. and formed the first communist Trotskyist movement. Dissident, again, they're dissident communists allied with the Trotsky faction against the Stalin faction, called the Communist League of America, with just 100 people. But it kept growing throughout the early 30s through fusions, and eventually entered the Socialist Party and won over the left wing. All the young people like Irving Howe and so on were won over to the Trotskyist group called the Appeal faction. They had a magazine called Socialist Appeal. And then in 1938, they formed the Socialist Workers' Party.
Right.
And there are two central leaders, Cannon and Max Shachtman.
Right.
Then at the beginning of World War II, with the invasion of Poland and Finland and so on, they come to a big disagreement and they split, unfortunately, because together they were something impressive.
I'll bet.
So intellectuals are drawn to this communist Trotskyist faction of the communist movement in the 30s because it's a way of defending the ideals and goals of Lenin and the Russian Revolution, but critiquing Stalin from a communist point of view. You know, if you were part of that movement, you had a communist take on communism. And it seemed to have some kind of traction in different parts of the world. It was coming together. It wasn't huge, but especially with Trotsky as the leader, who he was a genius. I mean, some people say he was a fanatic, and I see signs of that myself. But he was a genius, and so they were drawn to this, and they launched, this early partisan review, which was a break from the communist movement, is terrific. The 1937, well, it's even good before when it was on communism, but it's really stellar in the late 30s, and that partisan editors were close to the Trotskyist movement. Many of them taught at the Marxist school, along with Cannon and Shachtman. Even the poet Delmore Schwartz, I've written a lot about Delmore Schwartz, the genius poet, though as you know, he was mentally ill. He taught at this school. They were very close and inspired, and it's somewhat of a tragedy what happens to them in the 40s and 50s. So it's a way of being a revolutionary, a Leninist, but without the taint of Stalinism, and in fact showing an explanation for why Stalinism happens. I think that's important. If you're going to be against Stalin, you've got to show why it happened and what the alternatives are. And Trotskyism did contribute to that. I don't think it's the total picture. There's a book by Marcel van der Linden on different theories of the Soviet Union, where he shows that this interpretation tells you a little bit, and this one tells you a little bit. If you put them all together, you kind of get a picture of what happened. But it's not, you can't attribute it to one particular Trotskyist or state capitalist or some other theory. You have to have a composite picture.
Yeah, thank you for that. I've done some work on Michael Harrington, the founder of the Democratic Socialists of America, and he's influenced by Max Shachtman.
Yes.
Shachtman ends up going pro-imperialist.
Yes.
Unfortunately. And which is very tragic. And of course, that milieu is also what attracts CLR James to the United States. And I think they commissioned him to give a series of talks on the civil rights question just as it's really starting. So it's but you didn't mention the intellectuals that followed Cannon. What was it? Wilhelm Reich's daughter?
Yes, Lori Wright, yes.
I found that interesting. Although she was not died in the Wheelrightian, even though it's her father.
Yes, she did have differences. She was a member, and her husband was a member. But they did become rather right wing later on.
Oh, they did.
As did so many people, because they lost their way during that whole Cold War thing. And so it's important to have alternatives. When people criticize you, you shouldn't just huddle down and say it's all lies. You should present an alternative if you're going to give people a way to move forward.
I wanted to ask you, one of the things, Professor Wald, that a lot of socialists are talking about in our time is the historical influence of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And I have the view, and I talk about this on my show. I'd be curious to see what you think of it. I don't know. In other words, some socialist thinkers today think that a a program like that, this kind of big state-funded ideological propaganda campaign of anti-communism has a profound, almost like causal effect on the determination of people's political worldviews. I don't myself necessarily agree with that, although, and I know that you mentioned already in our pre-email exchange that you don't put too much stock in the idea that the Congress for Cultural Freedom really determined too much ideologically. Could you speak to that, and maybe if it didn't, or if it did, and how you assess its influence on the American left? What did it actually do in terms of damage?
Well, it is true. It did do a lot of political damage because of its creation of this myth of the free world versus the Iron Curtain, which is obviously not so simple. The free world was doing a lot of terrible things, both domestically, McCarthyism, which they did not fight aggressively. I mean, they said they didn't like McCarthy and he was using the wrong methods, but they kind of agreed with McCarthy's goals. And of course, the foreign policy of the U.S. in that period is not freedom. What was going on in in Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, Iran, and we're still paying the price for supporting the dictatorship in Iran and stuff like that. So they politically they created that myth, and they allied intellectuals at one side or the other. You had to, you had to take a position. If you were not with this free world idea, then you were an apologist for communism and stuff like that. So how did they affect and control literature and art? So it seems the books that I've read, I have looked at some of their papers, but I'm not. That's not really my field. I mean, a book like the Mighty Wurlitzer that author is quite good. Is very helpful in this. I mean, it seems like that there were liberals running the CIA and their cultural activities, and they were many of them were Yale educated, and
Right.
Literature professors and stuff like that were involved in this. But I think people were drawn to it because they were also moving in that direction. And
Right.
you're moving in a direction, and there are people welcoming you with free trips abroad and great publications. Encounter is a very well done publication, Encounter magazine, and they did give money to Partisan Review, and they did have this whole network, Le Moment and stuff around the world and so on. So it draws people there. But I don't know that it controlled literature in terms of dictating. But people self-police themselves. If you want to appear in a certain publication, you don't say things that are going to piss off the editor,
Right.
and so on. So people adapted to that, so I think it's that kind of impact. Now there is a new book from Princeton that I haven't read yet about the impact on the third world in terms of these publications that existed in Africa, and how writers related to that. And I gather from the reviews that the author shows that it's not a mechanical thing where people just simply line up. They make negotiations and so on. And it's also possible that you can appear in these publications and do subversive things that are not caught. And that's part of my comment on socialist realism, is that some of these Soviet writers and artists did subversive things within the framework of socialist realism. So I'm not convinced there's any control, but I do think that the Congress for Cultural Freedom really perverted the possibility. It corrupted American liberalism and American leftism to a devastating degree. And to this day, I can't get young people to take Partisan Review seriously in the late 30s and early 40s because of what happened later. People remember the betrayal of the partisan editors, even though, one of them, Philip Robb, insisted he was still a Leninist to the end. But anyway, they participated in this American Culture for Committee for Cultural Freedom. Because of the way they turned out, they think, well, they must have been rotters from the beginning. That's a whole problem with understanding this anti-Stalinist communist tradition, which I think is really the best hope of a real continuity and revival of the American left.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting because, who the gatekeepers are in the American literary scene is an interesting question. I mean, for example, Edmund Wilson probably would have more power for deciding the career of a young writer if he read their book and liked it than,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Because there's certain figures. I mean, especially if you read his elevation of Hemingway, for example, is very interesting. Um, as a side point, what do you make of Edmund Wilson's To the Finland Station, and he's got a nice essay on Marxism and literature in America where he talks about Mike Gold. You may remember that.
Yes.
He's an important figure, obviously, in American literature, without question. Have you written about Wilson out of curiosity?
Yes, in the New York Intellectuals, I have a section on Wilson. Though remember, I did a lot of that work when I was a graduate student, and even though I didn't publish the book till 1987, the Wilson material I actually wrote for a Marxist journal when I was a graduate student. So it's not up to date in the latest scholarship on Wilson. But I certainly have a high opinion of that essay. It's true that he promoted Mike Gold at the beginning of the 30s. There was the Thornton Wilder affair and stuff like that, where Gold was sort of in the news a lot. But his view was he wanted to take communism away from the communists. That was his slogan. So he was an independent communist influenced by Trotskyism, not a member of any group or anything like that. And that lasted up through the late 30s when he did most of To the Finland Station.
Mm-hmm.
Again, he's not an orthodox Marxist. He doesn't like dialectical materialism. He doesn't like dialectics. He thinks it's kind of mythological and so on. A lot of these people drawn to Marxism and communism in that period, and I think today, including myself, are not like these orthodox types. We like a lot in Marx, especially his critique of capitalism, but we're not sold on every little aspect of it. And so Wilson also, as time goes on, reveals this kind of cranky weirdness. So on the one hand, he wasn't paying his income tax, as you know.
Oh, I actually didn't know that.
And they caught him on that. He said, well, I was protesting the Cold War. Well, maybe. But he gets some cranky ideas toward the end of his life. So he's one of these eccentric radicals.
I see.
The book is quite brilliant, To the Finland Station. I like it a lot.
Well, he's a great essayist, and I always enjoy his work. Speaking of committed radicals, there is a book by Vivian Gornick called The Romance of American Communism, which I think everyone should read on the left. It's a very important work. It captures firsthand the experience of American communism, perhaps at its peak. You write about the book. It is obviously obvious why it's of interest to you. It's all about commitment and the kind of question of the authenticity. And how do you appraise that work? How has it aged? And am I right that it's a very exemplary work in the history of American communism? And sort of, could you speak to its importance for us?
Yes, it had a big impact on me. I've read it several times, and but there's a lot of intriguing aspects to it. First of all, when it came out, it was in a period when there were a lot of controversy about the new interest in communism. A lot of people were upset because it seems to portray the communist experience very positively. If you read the book carefully, it's actually a warning. Because she decided to write it when she was involved in the feminist movement, and she heard a lot of things she didn't like being said in a feminist movement, and she found this kind of rage growing up with dogmatism in herself against people she disagreed with, and she realized that's similar to what she didn't like about communism. And so she wrote this book to give sort of both sides of that. But I don't think most people who read it see that, because it's such a wonderful narrative of people you admire who are doing terrific things. Another fascinating thing about the book is it's poorly sourced. She did these interviews and she changes the names and she tells these stories. There's no documentation. You can't double check. Well, is this true? Did that really happen? And so on. And yet the fact is that from my own research, and I should say that I'm kind of, old fashioned. I want to document everything, every claim. And if I don't know for sure, I say in the footnotes or whatever, this is not 100%. It's essentially accurate. I don't know how. She listened carefully. She does make one big mistake. The character Bitterman, she sees as this kind of very, very negative character. She doesn't understand the personal things that were going on in the real person's life. His son had committed suicide. He was diagnosed with a fatal illness. His behavior is explanatory in other ways. But it's mostly So I did interview myself, some of the people she interviews, and she gets the point, which is that, romanticism, that's exactly right. It was a passion. It was a belief in ideals and impurity. But out of that, you do stupid things and you make mistakes. And that's part of the debate we see going on the campuses today. I read all the time about the pro-Palestinian demonstrations, and people, including the New York Times, sickeningly say, well, it's anti-Semitic, it's Jew hatred. No, these kids are idealists. They think correctly that the Israeli state is committing genocide, it's doing terrible things. They want to stop it. Their motivations have nothing to do with Jew hatred. It's sympathy for humanity. These are idealists. In their fanaticism, do they do some stupid things and some slogans that nobody can understand or will we misunderstand, or some actions like, if you put a Nazi insignia on somebody's house, it looks like you're trying to intimidate a Jewish person. They may mean it because they're saying, well, that person's acting like a Nazi, but it's misinterpreted. So, it's the same kind of thing today where people's passions can be good, but if you don't rein in those passions and use some rationality and strategic thinking, things can backfire. And we've seen that many times on the left. I mean, I'm totally with this movement, 150%. I argue for it all the time, but I recognize that dumb things are done. So that's her story about American communism. Honest passions, good ideals, but a kind of fanaticism at times that leads to making mistakes. And maybe she doesn't emphasize the pro-Soviet aspect of it. I mean, I think that's the biggest mistake, was idealizing the Soviet Union. But it's a terrific book, and it circulated. It got a lot of negative reviews when it came out. Now it's reissued, gets totally positive reviews. It's just a fascinating phenomenon. So yeah, I write a lot about it and thought a lot about it. And
yeah, I wanted to ask you about the figure John Brooks Wheelright.
Yeah.
Can you introduce this figure to my audience? A snapshot of this writer. What is appealing with Wheelright for you? You've written quite a lot on this figure, and I myself am less familiar of all the people we've talked about, so it'll be an introduction for me as well.
Yeah. So I've made a lot of mistakes and misjudgments in my life, and when I began hearing about Wheelright as a neglected poet, I saw that a lot of important poets and writers of that period and a few later on realized that Wheelright is a genius, an amazing poet who does all kinds of remarkable things. And it's a synthesis of communism and various kinds of strains of religion, because he goes through various religious phases until the end when he actually abandons religions. And the more I read of Wheelright, I thought, writing a book on Wheelright, this is going to be like a big deal. It's going to have a big impact. He had been, he was from a famous New England family, which traces its roots back to the antinomian controversy. He had an ancestor, Reverend John Wheelright, who was big with Anne Hutchinson and the antinomian controversy in New England. So he came from this prominent family, and his father was a famous architect who did commit suicide. So he was involved in the Socialist Party in the early 30s, and then he switched when the Trotskyist I mentioned entered the Socialist Party. He allied with them and, became a devoted Trotskyist and a supporter of Cannon in terms of the Shachtman fight and so on. Wrote quite a number of books. He was killed in 1940 in a car accident that's still under dispute. In my book about Wheelright, I contacted the police department and witnesses and all kinds of stuff. And it's possible that he even jumped in front of the car, because the person driving the car was not arrested. But it's sort of gone down in history as a mystery as to why he died in that accident. In any event, when the book came out, it got reviewed in the New York Times, which for me, when you're an academic like me, that's a big deal, favorably by Peter Schedule. And it got some other reviews, but it never caught on. And so there are very few Wheelright admirers today, although if you look back in literary history, he was considered a major figure by Horace Gregory and Matthew Josephson, R.P. Blackmer reissued, and so so he's still very important, but apparently there's no interest or response at the current time. So that was a big misjudgment of mine.
I wanted to ask you about the theme of gender and sexuality across Bohemian Bolsheviks and its importance as a sort of why does it emerge as very important for you? My assumption might have to be that it emerges in this nexus between sort of the writer's biography and social taboos, social norms, and the fact that, I mean, it is interesting to me as somebody that teaches how the progressive movement of gay rights, gosh, how different and how repressive sexual expression was in the 20th century. It's hard to convey that, I think, to young audiences or to young people who have grown up in the wake of certain Supreme Court decisions, things of that nature. And you're obviously old enough to know what I'm talking about here. So there's a lot to be said about this, but can you say some general things about its importance for your latest book?
Yeah, it is important because of all the interesting parallels between the misrepresentations of people's political commitment and political allegiances and their personal and sexual life and sexual identity. It's all been kind of repressed, and you can find it in the literature if you're aware of it and if you're looking for it. But if you're looking for something that's out explicit and so on, it's harder to find. However, I think it began. My own interest just began with the question of why so few women writers of the left had been recovered and appreciated, up until the 1960s, when there was a turning point when Agnes Smedley's Daughter of Earth was reissued, and Feminist Press did some heroic stuff. And one of my students, Paula Rabinowitz, and another woman, Charlotte Nicola, did this book called Writing Red, where they recovered women's writings of the 30s in an anthology and so on. So I began to see that this whole question of gender, first of all, was about the neglect of women. But then when I began doing my biographical research, I was kind of astonished that, so many of these writers had complicated sexual lives. They were bisexual or gay. At first that bisexuality was not accepted. A lot of gay scholars said, no, people say they're bisexual. They're not wanting to admit that they're actually gay or lesbian. But in fact, I think there were a lot of bisexual writers. And this came up, but I didn't quite understand how to put it into how it was expressing itself through literature. So I did rely on people who had more specialist training. I didn't have much gender training in any of my experiences. Although, through politics, I was a member of a group called the Young Socialist Alliance as a student, which it's a Trotskyist group, although I mistakenly thought that it was also a new left group. And I joined the Socialist Workers' Party, the adult group, again, thinking that this is a group that was, because it was celebrating Che Guevara and Malcolm X and was allied with the International Marxist group in England led by Tariq Ali and so on. I thought it was moving in a new left direction, but turned out I was wrong as usual.
What do you mean by that distinction, that it was not new left? You mean that it was exclusive and adhering to certain normative cultural practices that were exclusionary? What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I mean, Orthodox. There were these Orthodox Marxist groups that emerged out of the 30s, such as the Socialist Workers' Party, the Communist Party, and other smaller groups. And in the 1960s, the Young Socialist Alliance, the Social Workers' Party, began to open up, recruit young people, had a terrific policy on the anti-war movement, very early involved in the women's movement. And when I was a member, they were opened up to the gay movement. There was first a big debate. I mean, it turned out that earlier, apparently, gay members had been excluded. I didn't know this, but they had reversed that. They carried on an intervention, the gay movement, lots of interest. And so I was educated through that debate and discussion about the gay movement, which personally I had thought most gays and lesbians were artists and writers, like I'd read James Baldwin and so on. I didn't think about gays in the working class and so on. So this debate and discussion opened this up to me. Later, they closed it down because they were not moving really in that direction, or at least the leaders changed their mind and went in another direction, more back toward the old orthodoxy and then in weirder directions. So I was out of it after the 70s. So I got an education through that movement, which I think was an advance of the rest of the public. I think the first talks on women's liberation that I heard at Antioch College was sponsored by this group. So I see them as having been very helpful to my political education. In any event, I was aware of these kinds of issues generally, and I sort of educated myself more as I did my research. And I began to see the similarity of the repression of sexual identity and the repression of political identity. And that's how I come into the subject. So in this collection, I have a whole part of this on gays, lesbians, and women and so on, and the left, where I draw out these connections and try as much as possible to reveal their actual lives. Now, of course, with sexual activity, there aren't usually too many witnesses. So I have to be cautious. And some of the people that I identify as likely gay and lesbian, is never 100% certainty what's going on. Many people perceive poets and writers simply as male poets and writers as effeminate and think therefore they're gay or lesbian. So I try to be careful in documentation. I don't feel I have like sensational revelations and so on, but I think what I say is pretty sound. And now there's another book by Aaron Lechleiter, which has come out about gays and lesbians in the communist movement, which is very important and hasn't gotten as much attention yet as I would have thought, but it's a solid piece of research.
Fabulous. Well, this has been such a great conversation. I've learned a great deal from engaging with Bohemian Bolsheviks. And once it becomes available on Haymarket, right, it will be in paperback, right?
Yes. It's too expensive now for like your normal.
Right. I got a free copy. People can always email the publisher and request a free copy, but you got to write a review or do an interview. So it will be out soon in paperback with Haymarket, and I'll put a link in the show notes. My final question, Professor Wald, is if for people that are compelled by your research and want to pursue research in a way that you've done it, what tips might you have in a general sense, and how did you learn your method? Like, this idea of going back to Gornick and, okay, well, let's make sure that her sources are correct, or interview, that's very meticulous, and it requires a lot of labor. It's not. So what keeps you going? What keeps you energetic enough to pursue these details and create these analyses? So I guess there's two questions. One is, what motivates you? Where did you learn your method, and how can others, begin to pursue research in a similar vein that as you've done?
Yeah, very important to me personally. I mean, first of all, remember that my interest in this topic grew out of life experience. I did not set out to become a professor. I did not set out to become a scholar. In fact, I thought I was going to become some sort of creative writer, but I just don't have what it takes to be a poet, a novelist, or whatever. So it goes back to my life experience as an alienated high school student. I was not that interested in college. I didn't want to be Joe College. I wanted to go out and have experience. And I'd watch this TV show, you're too young to know about it, called Route 66, about these two young men who traveled all over the United States, a different city every night and different adventure. So I went
kind of like a Kerouac style thing, or
yeah, Kerouac and that sort of stuff. Route 66. So I went to Antioch College, which partly because of the Bohemian radical aura, but also a work study program. So every 3 months you were in a different city and have experiences and so on. And I, later fell into probably the research academic thing, because I saw I could not be a creative writer, and I knew if I was a journalist, I'd have to follow what the publications wanted. And I saw, well, with tenure, you can do much more of what you want once you get tenure. So it all my interest did not grow out of academia. It grew out of life experience, political activity, total identification with the anti-colonial struggle, with the anti-racism, and so on, with Palestinian human rights. And well, this is what is at the core of it. But I wanted to understand this problem of commitment. And I'm fortunate that my models here are important, because a lot of young radicals and Marxists, they turn to the theorists first, and they want to be a famous theorist. You know, they see these superstars. And some of these superstars are incredible. I mean, Frederick Jameson, what a magnificent scholar this guy was. But, you know, not everybody can be a Frederick Jameson or Edward Said or a superstar. And I certainly couldn't. That wasn't my route. And I was drawn to these sort of older left liberals. They were not Marxist in my sense, but Daniel Aaron's Writers on the Left, Walter Rideout's The Radical Novel, and James Gilbert's Writers and Partisans were the books that really impacted me the most. There were others too. I liked Leslie Fiedler's work too, but those three, and I went to visit all three, you know, meet them in person, face to face, and talk to them. And I became very close to Aaron. The other two I met were friendly, but the Aaron, I became very close to Aaron. He was not a Marxist anymore. He had been pro-communist when he was at Harvard in the 30s. And their method was research first. You theorize after you do the research, or you do it in tangent with the research. You have these sort of successive hypotheses that you keep correcting, but the research is important. And they all did some degree of oral history, which I think that's important. You can't believe everything you're told, because, you know, old people tell stories over and over again, often the same story they want to tell. You have to challenge them. But meeting people face to face and sizing them up and looking at their papers and their correspondence, that's an important part of the picture, along with understanding the politics and networks of relationships and so on. So I'm pretty empirically grounded. I consider myself a Marxist in a broad sense, but I am based on empirical research. That's the best advice I can give to a younger scholar. I understand the appeal of theorists. I understand the superstar attraction and all that. But, you know, if you want to know what actually happened, and I mean, that is connected to the fact that I have been a political activist in the past. That is, I don't want to make mistakes. I want to know what other people did, what went right and wrong. If you have it's important to me not to be wrong. I'm one of those fanatics. I feel terrible if somebody points out an error, and I will admit it. And I can remember every little factual error that's come up in my work. You know, I have nightmares about it. I don't want to make mistakes. And I think it's that, you know, that passion to know and understand what really happened and tie it into practical work in terms of building a new socialist movement and finding my own identity within a collective and so on, which is why I joined those radical groups. I was not some kind of new left giant leader. I wanted to be part of a team of young people creating a new world. That this all kind of fits together for me. Mm-hmm. And I know other people have a struggle. A lot of people say I can't be an activist and I can't be a scholar. You know, my scholarship will have to be my contribution to the cause. You know, I understand that that's a problem and it's difficult, but it can also work. Mm. And in fact, I mentioned reviewing those biographies. One thing about the autobiographies actually, of Tariq Ali and David Rodiker and Wald and so on, they are both activists and scholars.
Yeah.
Managed to pull it off. So it can be done.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been fabulous. If I might have a slight encore question.
Sure.
Unexpected, but it comes to mind that most people think about American Bohemianism, and of course they think about the Beat generation. And you don't write about the Beats, as far as I know. Although, what do you make of them?
Well, as a young person, I was very drawn.
Yeah.
To them. And particularly Ginsberg. I actually went to Ginsberg's apartment once. I had a job in New York working for a newspaper called East Village Other, which it's gone away, but it was supposed to be a rival to the Village Voice, you know, more radical. Mm. And I went to his apartment to see if he was there, and he unfortunately wasn't. And I later heard Ginsberg at a conference. I never did meet Kerouac. And I did work for a period in the Lower East Side, met a number of people out of the Beat movement and so on. I worked at a bookstore called Tompkins Square Books, which was trying to compete with City Lights Books, and we had our own City Lights type magazine called Down Here. A poet named Ray Bremser was one of their big guys, and so on. So I did participate in that kind of late Beat movement, and was always attracted to it. And there was a kind of a communist cause. Ginsburg had a communist mother and a socialist father. Of course, Kerouac was pretty right wing,
Right.
But others did have communist connections and associations.
Burroughs was pretty obscure politically, I think.
Yeah.
Unclear where he stood, but he's sort of a vague anti-establishment figure in some way, but highly influenced by Wilhelm Reich, and very, I would characterize Burroughs as very idiosyncratic, although hugely influential on later musicians and other poets and artists, and even French theory in interesting ways. So, but also I feel that there is a sort of cultural radicalism that the Beats represent that is very distinctive and admirable. And despite the fact that they may not be great Marxists, with the exception of Ginsburg, they certainly have set so many on the American left free from a cultural point of view, or inspirational point of view, seems to me. That seems undeniable. In fact, intellectually, there's a recent book on the Beats, I don't know if you're aware of it, by Lardis, I think his name is, about how their intellectual influence was actually Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West. That in the early Beat milieu, that was the book that really seized them and shaped their political consciousness. I found that funny.
Connections I'll mention. You mentioned Burroughs. That his cut up. I mentioned this in the Bolshevik Bohemians book. His cut up method was inspired by a Trotskyist named Brian Gisson. And Gisson was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in the U.S. and was proletarianized and so on. So these people did interact, and there are several other Beat figures. I'm trying to remember. There's the African American poet Kaufman, Kauffman. Was it Bob Kaufman? Was a communist, and of course Walter Lowenfeld's linked up to the Beats. So there are these radical connections too.
Yeah. Well, Professor Wald, we want to thank you for your time and for your work. It's been extremely illuminating and inspiring, if I might say so. Everyone should check out Bohemian Bolsheviks as well as all of your other works. And I wish you the best of luck with the one on the Helena Sheehan, Tariq Ali work you're currently putting together. Is there any other works that you're cooking up right now, or is that the primary one?
Well, I've done a long review of the Andrew Hartman book on Marx in America.
Oh, really?
I hope will come out soon. Things take time. And there are a number of, I'm still kind of obsessed with these minor figures that nobody else cares about. There's a guy named Philip Stevenson, who was a communist who lived in New Mexico, was involved in many strikes led by Native Americans and Mexicans. Wrote 4 novels about them that have been completely forgotten. I'd love to have a chance to publish a substantial piece on him. So it's a question of having the time and the publishing venues. And I also edit 2 magazines. I'm big on editing Against the Current, which comes out of Detroit. And I also work on the editorial board of Science and Society, which is a historic magazine out of the American Communist movement.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll close there. Thanks, everyone. All the
best.
best.
All right. Thank you.
Give me one sec.